Officer Davis entered the house cautiously and was met with an eerie silence. The only sounds were the pounding of his own heart and the creaking of the old wooden floorboards. Suddenly, he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. He rushed up the stairs, gun drawn, ready for whatever was waiting for him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he saw a ghostly figure floating. The figure was transparent and glowing, and it let out a spine-chilling scream. Officer Davis tried to back away, but the ghostly figure moved closer to him. Suddenly, he felt a cold, icy hand on his shoulder. He turned around to see a group of ghostly figures surrounding him, all with their eyes locked onto him. The officer tried to run, but he found himself trapped. The windows and doors were locked from the inside, and he couldn't escape. The ghostly figures continued to circle him, their screams echoing through the house. As the night went on, the ghostly figures became more and more violent. They began to throw objects at the officer, shattering glass and causing. The officer was finally able to escape by breaking a window and jumping out, but he never forgot the terror he experienced that night. From that day on, the police department made it a rule to never respond to any calls regarding paranormal activity. They knew that some things were better left alone, and that the paranormal world was not something to be messed with. It was a dark and stormy night when Officer Davis received a call from a terrified family. The family claimed that there was a ghost haunting their house, and they were too scared to stay there any longer. Officer Davis initially brushed off the call, thinking it was just a prank. But as the police officers stepped out of the car and began to investigate, they too felt the presence of something sinister. Doors began to slam shut on their own, objects moved across the room without explanation, and a cold breeze blew through the house, even though all the windows were shut tight. As they searched for the source of the paranormal activity, the officers began to feel as though they were being watched by some. Finally, they stumbled upon a hidden room in the basement, where they found evidence of a long-forgotten murder. As they combed through the clues, the officers realized that the spirit of the murdered victim had been trapped in the house all these years, unable to rest until justice was served. But as they tried to solve the mystery, the spirit grew more and more agitated, causing the paranormal activity to escalate to dangerous levels. In the end, the police officers were forced to call in a team of paranormal investigators to put the restless spirit to rest and bring peace to the town of Millfield. To this day, residents whisper about the haunted house and the brave police officers who risk everything to confront the supernatural. It was a dark and stormy night, and the small town of Millfield was enveloped in a thick blanket of fog. As the residents huddled inside their homes, a strange force began to make itself known. At first, it was just a faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of the rain pattering against. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Soon, the residents of Millfield realized that they were not alone. Something unseen was lurking in the shadows, watching them from the darkness. Terrified, they dialed 911 and begged for help. Within minutes, a squad car arrived on the scene, its blue and red lights piercing through the fog. When the police arrived, they searched the area and found nothing. But as they were about to leave, they heard a strange whispering coming from the woods nearby. They followed the sound, only to discover an old abandoned house. As they cautiously approached the house, they heard more whispers and footsteps coming from inside. They drew their guns and entered, expecting to fight. But the house was empty, except for a single room that was freezing cold and gave them a sense of dread. The police soon realized that this house had a dark history. It was said that a woman in a white dress had been murdered there years ago, and her spirit still haunted the place. The couple had unknowingly driven into her path, and the police had inadvertently stumbled upon the scene of her murder. As they left the house, the police could feel a cold presence following them, and they knew that they had encountered something truly terrifying that night. From then on, they made sure to steer clear of that old abandoned house and warned others to do the same. Late one night, a young couple was driving home after a date when they saw a figure in the road. As they got closer, they realized it was a woman in a white dress, standing in the middle of the street. They tried to swerve to avoid hitting her, but their car suddenly stalled. The woman in the white dress vanished before their eyes, leaving them feeling terrified and confused. They quickly called the police, hoping for some explanation for what they had just witnessed. But as the police were leaving, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the attic. They rushed back upstairs and found the family huddled together in fear, pointing at an old trunk in the corner of the room. As they approached the trunk, the lid slowly lifted on its own, revealing a ghostly figure that floated out and disappeared into thin air. The police were left stunned and frightened, realizing that they had just encountered a real-life paranormal entity. From that day on, the old house in Millfield was avoided by everyone in town, as it became known as the haunted house that even the police couldn't explain. It was a dark and stormy night, and the small town of Millfield was quiet, with most people huddled up in their homes, trying to stay warm and dry. But in one old house on the outskirts of town, things were not as they seemed. A family had recently moved into the house, but they soon realized that something was not right. They heard strange noises in the middle of the night, saw objects move on their own, and felt an eerie presence around. The family tried to ignore these strange occurrences, but they eventually became too much to bear. One night, they heard loud banging and crashing coming from the attic, and they finally decided to call the police. When the police arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The family tried to explain what they had been experiencing, but the police just dismissed it as their imagination running wild. As they investigated further, they discovered that the house had a dark history. It was the site of a gruesome murder many years ago. The spirit of the victim was said to still haunt the place, seeking revenge on those who disturbed its eternal rest. From that day on, the police officers refused to return to the house, and it became known as one of them. The story of the paranormal encounter spread quickly, and it was said that those who dared to enter the house would face the wrath of the vengeful spirit that still lurked within its walls. It was a dark and stormy night when the police received a strange call from an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The caller reported hearing strange noises coming from inside the house and seeing flickering lights in the windows. As the police arrived on the scene, they could feel an eerie presence lurking in the air. The old house creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, making the officers move. As they entered the house, they noticed a strange mist swirling around their feet, and the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. The officers' flashlights flickered and sputtered, making it hard to see what was ahead. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. They raced up the stairs, but as they reached the top, they found themselves face to face with a ghostly figure, hovering in. The officers were frozen with fear as the ghostly figure slowly floated towards them, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Just as it was about to touch them, the officers pulled their guns and fired, but the bullets had no effect on the apparition. The ghostly figure let out an ear-piercing scream before vanishing into thin air. The police officers were left shaken and bewildered, unsure of what had